Britain's free speech crisis is deepening. Police are knocking on doors over online opinions, and laws meant to target hate speech are being used to silence dissent. And when Elon Musk highlighted the UK's grooming gang scandals, the media attacked him rather than the perpetrators or the people in power who neglected it. Tom Slater, editor of Spiked Online, joins me to break down how Britain is sleepwalking into censorship. We discuss the rise of authoritarian speech restrictions, how woke culture shapes media and politics, and why merely mentioning the background of grooming gang offenders is now politically dangerous. We also dive into Slater's viral Cambridge Union speech, where he dismantled the claim that Trump is a 21st century fascist. Is labeling populists as fascists a way to shut down debate? And what does this say then about the political elite's fear of ordinary voters? Join us for today's conversation. Welcome, Tom Slater, to Rak Höger.
Thanks for having me.
And Rak Höger is a straight right, but it's also a right cross. And every time I try to explain that to like an English speaker, it sounds like people react like, but why did you want to do you want to punch people in the face? Like, no, but it's a pun in Swedish. Yeah, oh, yeah. But Spiked Online, you're the editor. And so why is it called Spiked? I mean, since I'm sort of criticizing myself for my choosing of my name.
No, absolutely. It's one of those names which, when you hear the backstory, it makes perfect sense, which is that in journalism, the phrase in British journalism, when a story is rejected, is that it's spiked, because editors used to literally have a kind of nail on their desks in which you would spike a story. So the idea when the magazine was set up by our founding editor, Mick Hume, was that we would publish things that other people wouldn't. And it also has that extra kind of element of spikiness to it. Certain edge maybe, but it's one of those names that whilst when you explain it makes perfect sense, it does lead to many various jokes about whether or not we're a Hypnol review website or what have you, which is not true, to be absolutely clear. It's about us being against the grain and publishing things that other people wouldn't, is essentially what it comes.
Bill Cosby is not a subscriber, so
not as far as I know, and I would purge him from the rolls if I found out that he was.
Oh, it's good to hear. Okay, having sorted out that you're not actually a date rape site, we'll jump into a more or less controversial subject, Donald Trump. Because I watched you on the Cambridge, you had a speech at the Cambridge Union, and I just said to you before we started recording that it's sort of an odd thing because I mean the speech is great and your oratory is great, and that's the thing. I can't see this in a Swedish context. It just doesn't happen. This sort of rhetorical situation where you actually people listen and you have a speech and you argue for something like a debate club, but because in other respects Swedish and English or British culture is very similar, but in this regard it's very dissimilar, I would say. There's no flair here.
Since totalitarian control, messianic dictatorship, a cult of racial superiority, paramilitaries crushing the left at home, a Darwinian militaristic struggle abroad, the worship of war and violence, the mechanized attempt, let's not forget, to murder all of Europeans' Jews. If that sounds like America in 2025 to you, then I suggest you leave here and have a nice long lie down. In a second.
In the Swedish context, I would say I have certain flair, but that's also like saying you're the most. I usually said that I was the strongest bench presser out of all opinion journalists in Sweden. But then I actually found out I wasn't. But because we are so weak, like we're physically weak, it's the same here. If you have a flair of oratory in Sweden, it's not really saying something. Like we usually have, like in populist parties, you have charismatic leaders, but our populist party doesn't really, and that's a form of Swedish charisma. To not have charisma, I would say. But I wasn't going to talk about that. But in this speech, it was very interesting because basically you argued against labeling Donald Trump a fascist, and you pointed out that although his style is provocative and I mean he is who he is, and but he's more of a reaction against a failed establishment. And so, but what is the problem really of calling him a fascist? Because that's something we do over here as well.
And that was something that came up in the discussion, which was why get so exercised about it? I mean, in political discourse, in debate, people throw around accusations all the time. There's always an element of exaggeration, hyperbole, smears even. That's kind of part of the course. I think where Donald Trump is concerned, it's particularly concerning, first of all, because I really don't think we should throw that word around lightly. There's a certain point at which it becomes a kind of insult to historical memory, to the victims of fascism, to just use it as a byword for someone I dislike. I think it kind of degrades the meaning of those words, and also means that if there's anything that comes along that more deserves that label, it won't stick to them. And I think you do see that from time to time when you do have genuine kind of far-right fascist forces emerge. They've really learnt to play on the fact that the words have lost their meaning to a certain extent. So I think it's important for historical memory, for just being able to understand and describe the world. And I think it's also just, there's a certain element of which people are struggling to, it's a means through which the people who voted for Donald Trump, or the people who are voting for populist parties in general, are just being delegitimized. If they're voting for a fascist or a Nazi, they can be dismissed. They've been pushed into the level of racist hysteria. This is something that just needs to be faced down and confronted, rather than something that needs to be in any way kind of engaged with. And that's, in a way, the primary thing that I always come back to, is that whilst one can dislike and disagree with some of the figures who have been elevated by this populist revolt that we've seen transatlantically over the course of the past decade, I think it's a tremendous disservice to those voters who have a lot of very legitimate and understandable concerns to just say, oh, they've been hoodwinked or stirred into a frenzy by some kind of Nazi. It's just not true. And I think it's a way of just smearing ordinary people, effectively.
Yeah, and I mean, what you made a point in that speech of like, okay, what was fascism? Basically, it was a militaristic movement in a certain context in Europe. I mean, Europe was very sort of forlorn and had lost its way after the First World War, and many people wanted something else, and it felt like a rejuvenation or something like that. But it was like people marching in the streets, street violence, and they wanted to topple democracy, and they weren't saying, many of them, like, oh no, we're actually more like very democratic. They were saying like, democracy is too weak, we can't have it. And I think you said, like, if that sounds like Trump's movement, then you need to go and have a nice lie down. How would you characterize then? And is the problem then that we become less able to see what it actually is, or is it? I mean, is it the legitimization that is the problem, or is it that we actually then don't understand what we're looking at?
I think there's an element of people not properly engaging with the question of what fascism is and what it isn't. I mean, it's a huge academic debate in which there are some people who would apply the term kind of slightly more liberally. There are some people who would only apply it to, say, Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. There are some who make very clear distinctions between those two regimes anyway. I think that what you could generally say is that when we use the word fascism, I think what most people understand it to mean is Mussolini's Italy, is Hitler's Germany, is a few other kind of states and movements like it. And that its characteristics are pretty obvious and distinctive insofar as it is totalitarian control, a militaristic dictatorship, this purging of supposed internal alien figures, the external kind of militaristic expansionism, this worship of war and violence. The paramilitary is kind of crushing any dissent at home. It's if again you kind of, as soon as you start to actually just describe it, it's quite clearly fundamentally different from what we've been going through over the course of the past 10 years. And yet the desire to pretend that that isn't the case, I think, is really quite strong. And it's coming not just from Cambridge students at Oxford who are getting a bit carried away from themselves and may or may not be in need of a lie down. It's some of the most prominent politicians. I mean, that was the territory in which the last US election was fought, was whether or not Donald Trump was a fascist, effectively, and the one before it when he last stood. So it's a problem that really goes to the top. I really don't think it's out of any kind of cool-headed analysis of where Trump or any other populist leader is coming from and what they might have in store for the nation they're trying to lead. It's on the one hand, you could say it's a willful misunderstanding just to try and smear people. But I think also one of the defining characteristics of the recent years is that the established kind of technocratic elites have been driven into a kind of form of hysteria. In some respects, I think they believe it when they say it, that they think the worst days of the 20th century are coming back, because they've been so knocked off their perch and challenged that they're kind of striking around looking for explanations as to why this has happened other than them not being very good. And I think the fascism thing becomes a kind of excuse for that in some kind of way.
I mean, one of the criticisms of Trump this time around is, I mean, basically that he is the United States and him are too weak, and they are less willing to use military force. I mean, the whole, we're right in the middle of what's happening with Volodymyr Zelensky, who went to the Oval Office and had a huge fight with J.D. Vance and Donald Trump, and now Trump has stopped the delivery of weapons to Ukraine, but also that there's in the United States, there's a noticeable shift in the appetite for foreign engagement. And that's the opposite of what you would expect of a fascist leader then, if it's expansionist and you want, like, I mean, then Donald Trump seems like he would need more fascism from a European point of view. Like, the criticism is that we need more engagement from the US with the world, more US power in the world. And we are very disappointed now. So it's but I would just, it wasn't part of my plan to ask about it, but now that I brought it up, what was your take on like how Donald Trump responded to Zelensky in the Oval Office, what happened there, and also his position on the Ukraine-Russia war?
Well, I thought it was one of those moments, wasn't it, where one, depending on your kind of position, I suppose, on the Ukraine conflict or on Donald Trump, people saw that 50-minute meeting fundamentally differently, purely on the basis of their own political persuasion, I suppose. I mean, I would say that in that meeting in particular, there was an element of Zelensky being jumped on, humiliated. I think whether or not it was a planned ambush, some people were saying, Vance in particular, but Trump to a great extent as well, relished the opportunity to kind of give him a dressing down, to speak to their own domestic audience, basically, and say that we're putting America first and so on. The speed with which the White House kind of social media accounts pumped that message out, I think, was telling. On Zelensky's part, I think he had a terrible hand insofar he does have a new US administration, which is not simply trying to negotiate a peace. I think it does have at the kind of top level of it a sort of anti-Ukraine bent. I think it's fair to say that some of the people in that administration do not just consider Ukraine not America's problem, which is an entirely kind of coherent position to hold, but have kind of convinced themselves that Ukraine is the villain of the peace, that Zelensky is some kind of sinister dictator, that he's a sort of international welfare queen, which aren't coherent or rational positions in my view, and incorrect. So he was always going to be heading into that. I think it's fair to say he kind of played a bad hand badly. It's the reality of the situation that you're dealing with the leading global superpower being led by someone who's incredibly thin-skinned. And so in that context, do you want to rise to the bait to relitigate arguments and disagreements that you've had with either of those two gentlemen? Probably not. But at the same time, it's hard to walk away from watching that meeting and not feel like there is a kind of unpleasant tendency within this administration, whilst I completely understand the desire to kind of exit America's involvement in that particular conflict, to see Ukraine not just as kind of one side of a negotiation in which America is trying to play the sort of impartial go-between, but they tend to see the Ukraine issue for a very kind of partisan domestic political lens, which I think warps the nature of that conflict and to the detriment of Ukraine in these negotiations, I suppose.
I try to write about this and talk about, like, I think Zelensky did a bad job, but as you say, he had a very bad hand, and it's, I mean, from my point of view and what I've written before, I'm on his side, or the Ukraine side of things, and I agree morally and also how in his description of what has happened. But still, if you're dealing with Trump and Vance, you can do it better or worse, and I think even if it's understandable, and I mean, I agree with the most of what he says, or all of it. He did diplomatically. I'm glad I'm not a diplomat. I can say that, but so it's not coming from a expert experience of being a diplomat. But yeah,
it's one of those things where it's a really difficult high wire act to navigate that position where you're trying to, on the one hand, extract what you want to extract from that particular engagement, but also walk out of there with your, not just your own self-respect, but your kind of nation's self-respect as well, which has come to be painted by J.D. Vance in particular, but sections of the American right, as basically engaged in a giant money laundering expedition. How do you navigate that? Whereas you want to be seen to be diplomatic, but also to stick up for yourself. It's incredibly difficult. There's very few people who would have been able to do it. But as you say, that meeting probably could have ended differently.
I was going to ask you about because J.D. Vance, he held like it's connected to the Ukraine issue, you could say, but he held a speech at the Munich Security Conference, and it was very polarizing, you could say, but he was very critical of Europe. Of Sweden, that we recently had a court deciding that to convict Swedish citizen Salvan Najem for hate speech, or it's hets mot folkgrupp. It's sort of similar because what he had done really, but because of how the group that he criticized had perceived it. And his partner in crime, I mean literally now in Sweden, Salvan Momika, was murdered. And allegedly, or you can speculate that it was because he had burnt the Quran. But Salvan Najem was more, he was not like that. He is not like Salvan Momika. He's more like, he talks about what he's criticizing within Islam, and the court sort of what they based their verdict on was that Salvan Momika responds to people in the audience when he's criticizing Islam, and they're saying that they will murder him and slaughter him. And he says, I don't deal with roaches, or I don't give a damn about the opinion of cockroaches or insects. And they interpreted that in court like he's talking about all Muslims, but he's actually talking about the people who are threatening to murder him. But that was brought up by J.D. Vance, not to this excruciating detail, but he brought up the case, and but he also brought up the UK and the threat to free speech in UK, and so I was wondering, what did you make of that speech, and specifically the critique towards the UK?
I think it was potentially quite a watershed moment for Europe and this sort of experiment with hate speech legislation that various of our countries have been engaged in for a very long time now. I wish it didn't have to come from the Vice President of the United States, but what he said, certainly about the United Kingdom, in terms of our descent into a sort of new form of censorship is just correct. I mean, there was this very limp attempt in the Oval Office last week on the part of our Prime Minister when he went to go visit to push back on this claim that we had been engaged in the kind of censorship of our own citizens. But it's just a fundamental fact. I mean, in the UK, under one particular piece of legislation, and we have various pieces of speech code legislation effectively, it was estimated a few years ago that about 9 people a day were being arrested for saying what in the UK law is referred to as grossly offensive speech online. 9 people a day. And this was a kind of snapshot survey, didn't cover all police forces, relatively limited sample. At the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression in the US, they looked at that and they calculated on the basis of that survey alone, the UK is currently arresting more people for speech than America did during the first Red Scare. So the idea that we're not engaged in a project of censorship over here is for the birds. At the very least, I would like to see politicians kind of try to make the case for it. But I think the fact that they can't, I think, is sort of telling. Insofar as we have developed this system of kind of policing hate, of cracking down on what is deemed to be grossly offensive speech. Clearly, the people in power like it that way, but they struggle to articulate the case for it in public, essentially. It's only getting worse. That's the other thing, because you talk about things like hate speech laws and people assume that what you're talking about is really cracking down on the most extreme, far-right, fascistic forms of speech. And whilst as a sort of free speech fundamentalist, I think that is a bad road to go down in terms of challenging those kinds of prejudices. That's clearly one type of thing. That's not what's going on at the moment. I mean, there are numerous cases of people who have been arrested for everything from burning the Quran. That's become something which has crept into our own free speech debate. In fact, there were 2 cases over the course of about the past month in which people were arrested effectively for hate crime for burning a Quran in public. You've also got instances of people having been arrested and dragged through the courts for, in effect, kind of accurately gendering people on social media. That's something which has easily crept in. You're talking about positions which are, by any stretch of the definition, not extreme or far right, whatever. People might disagree with them. They might think the way in which they're expressed is a bit provocative or what have you. But we're no longer in that realm of just a very kind of specific, circumscribed form of censorship. And it needs to be reckoned with, I think. And the problem at the moment, I suppose, is that the political class is just constantly trying to kind of gaslight us and pretend that it isn't happening, which makes it very difficult to have a kind of argument from first principles about it.
If you don't live in Great Britain and you're on X, for example, or I mean Instagram, whatever, you can see these clips of like the British police coming to a house or an apartment of somebody who's tweeted something.
Mm-hmm.
And I generally think that Sweden is sort of bonkers on these issues, but that is like a step further or a few steps further than we have yet to go, I would say. But is there, and it's hard as an outsider, it's hard to exactly get the context right, or because you see a lot immediately. There's a lot of angry feelings and debate, and like this is what happened. But if you go to the bottom of it, what kind of substance is there in these cases? Is the police actually showing up if you tweet like something negative after terrorist attack? You tweet something negative like they shouldn't do this, or like those bastards, and then they're like. That's not actual cases, but there are more concrete cases. But what is the substance here? What is actually happening?
No, I think that's really important, because the UK and its speech laws have kind of been, become the focus of a lot of kind of testy online discussion, which can serve to sort of warp the perception on either side, because you've got, say, sections of the American right got very interested in this particular issue and very quickly kind of created this idea that Keir Starmer, our relatively recently elected Labour politician, has just kind of come in and ushered in some kind of personalist dictatorship. That's obviously not the case. Meanwhile, you have this reaction from people in the UK, which is this kind of phony patriotism which creeps in, where they're like, this is outrageous, we're a perfectly liberal country, how dare you misrepresent what's going on. The truth is obviously sort of somewhere.
How dare you
middle.
Misgender us?
Yeah. And it's the sad truth about it is that sort of this kind of new censorship has become disturbingly mundane. So there's an awful lot of people who are arrested over the course of any given year for things that they say on the internet. It's not as simple to say that someone could just take to social media and sound off about immigration and terrorism and get a knock at the door. But in a situation when you have such vague and ambiguous sort of speech laws, there have been some really crazy cases which do nudge up against that kind of standard. So there was a case recently in the wake of the Southport killings, this horrendous attack on young girls at a dance class, which, due to some kind of misinformation circulating online, was originally presented as the work of a Muslim asylum seeker. It turned out to be a British-born citizen who wasn't even Muslim, let alone an Islamist. But nevertheless, in response to that, you saw a lot of outright racist, violent speech being clamped down upon, again on the point of principle. I don't agree with that, but that's a kind of different category, I suppose. But you also saw instances like a gentleman called Jamie Michael in Wales, who posted a video inveighing against who he called the kind of radicalized idiots who'd come into the country illegally, saying that there needed to be a public meeting, saying that more protection needed to be put in place at schools and so on. And he was dragged through the courts. He was one of the few people who, amid all of those kind of speech-related arrests in the wake of Southport, actually pleaded not guilty, and it went to a jury trial, and he was acquitted basically within minutes. But that was a kind of clear-cut case in which someone sounding off about the issues, again, even he admitted in a slightly kind of clumsy fashion, but because of the time in which he was doing it and the context in which he was doing it, he was potentially facing a pretty significant prison sentence. So it's not as simple to say that if anyone just, right this second kind of took to social media to criticize mass migration should expect a knock at the door. But there are some really alarming cases which clearly are not about people inciting racial hatred, inciting violence or what have you. There are points in which it does kind of just breach in to people being arrested for, in effect, thought crime. And there's been farcical cases as well. I mean, there was one that really did the rounds a few years ago in Scotland where you had a kind of amateur comedic YouTuber who, as a clear joke, taught his girlfriend's pug to do a sort of Nazi salute. The joke being that it was his girlfriend doted on this dog too much, and so he wanted to turn it into the worst thing possible. He explained the context at length at the beginning of the video. He was taken to court and issued with about £800 fine as a consequence of that. So these are, whilst it's there is a kind of fever dream version of what's going on here, which isn't quite correct. The reality of the situation is thousands of arrests each year for speech, in effect, speech crime, and that by dint of how out of hand things have gotten, yes, just kind of expressing views which are deemed to be particularly provocative at a particular moment in time can land you in court. So I think it's really important to stress that things have gotten very, very bad indeed, and that whilst it might not be to the extreme that some might imagine it, it's still pretty bad. And the most disturbing thing about it is that it's become kind of mundane. As I say, it's not something which is almost shocking.
You had the riots after the killings, Southport, and I wrote about it as well. But like, it seemed like you had, of course, you had the right-wing extremists, and the thing that you actually, like, if you say like right-wing extremist or racist, those people were present and they were rioting. But you also had people who were demonstrating from my understanding, and people who were angry, and they were not sort of part of that crowd. But everything was sort of labeled sort of right-wing extremism. And then you had, perhaps understandably, but still nevertheless, gangs of Muslim men who were gathering and brandishing weapons. But the media, when it reported on this, it seemed like sort of the one thing is awful extremism and hatred, and the other is sort of upstanding citizens defending themselves and their community. And of course, it could be extremism on both sides, and everything could be bad about it. But it was sort of a skewed media representation. Or am I getting this wrong? Would you say? I wrote about it when it happened, so it might have something. It might have passed, and I missed it.
I think what happened, particularly with the sort of the differential treatment of, as you say, there's kind of racist riots targeting migrant hotels and mosques and so on, and the response that you saw from certain kind of elements within the Muslim community in certain inner cities, where you had people again tooled up, masked up, carrying knives and so on. There was a horrendous situation in Birmingham where a gentleman was just beaten very severely outside of a pub for no other reason than the fact that he was walking by this particular mob which had formed itself. The issue with the media, I think, was slightly more subtle insofar as they weren't necessarily saying these people were upstanding citizens sort of defending their own property, but there was a nervousness about talking about it, a tendency to kind of stare at their shoelaces a little bit. Some of the broadcasters were deprived of that privilege because you actually had, I think there was one Sky News journalist who was confronted by one of these kind of balaclava-clad individuals while she was broadcasting. They were kind of physically intimidated while she was trying to do their job. So in that case, that story certainly came to light. But it's kind of ignited this discussion within the UK about not just sort of two-tier policing, as it's often called, as their kind of differential treatment depending on the political optics involved of cracking down on a certain form of crime, a certain form of violence, what have you. But also that there's like a kind of two-tier media response as well, that depending on who it is doing the violence and for what reason, you might dwell on it more than you otherwise would. And I think that's something that people have really had enough with. And it also kind of warps our discussion about how this came about and how we might actually start to address it. Because whatever else you could say about the violence that we saw, the sort of racist street violence that we saw in the wake of Southport, we should want to get to grips with why it's taking place and how we can make sure that we tamp down on anything like that happening again.
We're talking about Americans. I guess Elon Musk is South African American, but when he started talking about the grooming gangs and the grooming gang scandal in Rotherham and other cities in Britain, I was sort of confused to begin with, because I thought that we had like talked about this, and I yes, I remember doing like podcasts with authors. I did with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who wrote a book about it, like Prey. I interviewed Asle Toje, a Norwegian academic and author who went to these cities and interviewed people, and we talked about it a few years back. So I was like, okay, has something surfaced now that I missed, and then I sort of realized, okay, he noticed it, so, but I didn't get like. So I can understand some people being sort of, it's not that it was quieted down just because you noticed it now, but I also was sort of, I thought that people misunderstood why it became a big thing again. But could you like explain what was the reaction to Elon Musk's tweeting about this and writing about it, and why did people react so in the way that they did in Britain, do you think? And how did they react?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because you could be, particularly if you're outside the UK, forgiven for thinking that this issue had basically never been discussed before, that it had been completely covered up, and that Elon Musk and a few kind of intrepid people that he was retweeting in the UK had perfectly brought this to light. That's obviously not the case. This is something which has been a really long-running and unpleasant debate that's been going on in the UK for some time. The issue, depending on how you sort of mark it, seems to date back to at least the 1980s, perhaps even before then. It started to be brought to the public attention in the early 2000s. There was a Labour MP called Anne Cryer, who represented a constituency in the north called Keighley, who started raising the alarm about this, and naturally was instantly smeared as sort of far-right racist. You then had...
but did she have a pug who could do the Roman salute?
No, exactly, because that's the real definition, as we know.
Yes.
And this pattern just keeps repeating itself. Eventually, it kind of came to the mainstream media's attention in around 2011, the Times newspaper, which is, again, our kind of newspaper of record. So it's not as if this issue wasn't reported on and discussed, but around that time, you had a journalist called Andrew Norfolk who started to published some of the first big exposés about that. And one kind of local inquiry after another started to uncover the scale of what we were talking about here, which, as people will know in the broad strokes, is predominantly Pakistani Muslim men preying upon poor and working class white girls in particular, though not exclusively, and subjecting them to the most depraved sex crimes, rape, trafficking, drugging, murder, you name it. And that the repeated pattern was not only in terms of the offending, but the response to it from the authorities, which was because of the profile of the perpetrator and to a certain extent as well because of the profile of the victims. It was covered up, ignored, and one report after another saying the same thing, that the victims were treated essentially as common prostitutes, despite them being 14, 15-year-old girls, treated as white trash effectively, and that the perpetrators, that it was seen as dangerous to tackle this issue too forthrightly because, in the words of one report, police were scared of a race riot kicking off because they were scared of it being politically incorrect. All of that has been known for some time. What I think Elon Musk's intervention into the debate did was it actually forced some kind of political reaction. So we've had we've had these reports for many years. We've had politicians responding to those reports, having 24 hours of saying this is terrible and we will learn the lessons, what have you. But nothing has ever really changed to any great extent. There was some attempts on the part of the last government, the last Tory government in its dying days, to kind of set up a task force to start to deal with this. And as a consequence of that, they ended up with about 500 arrests and isolating about a good few thousand victims, which tells you just how much there still probably is uncovered. But until Elon Musk entered into the debate, I think a lot of people, particularly in the sort of liberal left media and politics, just refused to deal with it. And it just put it firmly on the agenda. And again, it was regrettable that it took Elon Musk to do that. But that's just the nature of the attempt to kind of look the other way, that the Labour Party in particular, and I think the media in general, that's what they wanted to do. So in terms of the reaction, it was predictable. I mean, it became a debate purely about Elon Musk, whether he had too much power, whether his interventions into UK politics were a threat to democracy. Our Prime Minister responded by inveighing against those who, as he put it, were jumping on a far-right bandwagon. And then once again, it became a debate, as it's so often the case, whether you talk about grooming gangs, Islamism, you name it, where how people talk about a certain issue and who might be talking about it and for what reasons became more important than the issue itself. And luckily, I think the public outcry was such that there was a kind of response from Labour. There was pressure on them to launch a national inquiry, which they have not done, but they have launched more inquiries than they otherwise would have. But yeah, it was one of those depressing spectacles in which Elon Musk became the story, the people raising the issue became the story rather than the issue itself.
I find this over and over again in Sweden, and I think it's it's basically, I think it's the same in a lot of Western democracies, is that you have something like this happening and there are too many culpable parties. So sort of, you don't say it out loud, but you sort of decide like in silence that we're not going to let any heads roll on this, because it will be like a snowball effect of heads rolling. And like, so you don't have to, you talk about values and you talk about like, how can we like have better practices or conduct ethics and stuff like that. But it's a sort of like, yeah, but that was the guy who was in charge. Why don't we put up a guillotine, figuratively speaking? Like we need a public execution of the culpable parties. Wouldn't that change more than a new course in how to treat sort of each other with respect and dignity, and also do not see women in this way? We have to work on our values when it comes to gender equality. Yes, of course, that's great. That would be great. And as you brought up, I think something that the right especially has maybe not pointed out is that, yes, there was sort of hesitancy on the part of the police to point out the perpetrators, but also, so yeah, we all know about those kinds of girls and women, like they're slags, and then they want to come and complain after, like, the last boyfriend didn't go so well or something like that. how do they always end up in these kinds of situations? Like, is it really our job to fix their faulty, destructive behaviors and culture? Like, don't drink so much, don't do drugs then. Like, those kinds of attitudes. And I would say, I mean, that those attitudes are part of my class, and I mean the middle class, like how people are, and that's perfectly fine actually to say those kinds of things out loud when it comes to like white working class still. And that this is something that a lot of feminists who are some feminists who've criticized the handling of the grooming gang, they've brought this up, and I think they have a point. But the thing that I liked about the Elon Musk bringing it to light was that, I mean, sort of like, okay, but we're not going to let this go now because this guy, he might be crazy, he might be South African or American or both, or he might be on Mars, but he's still like he's bringing attention to who's culpable. Why hasn't something happened when it comes to this?
No, absolutely. And it might well be that the way in which he talked about it wasn't always accurate. I mean, he was kind of presenting it as purely the kind of fault of Keir Starmer and his particular, safeguarding ministers. There's if we're talking about guilty parties here, there's a lot of guilt to be spread around in terms of particular councils, police chiefs, the prosecutor, which obviously our Crown Prosecution Service was run by Keir Starmer for a number of years during this scandal. So there obviously is some culpability there. But you're right. I mean, the thing that it brought was kind of sustained political focus, because whenever there have been so many of these grooming gang cases uncovered. I mean, GB News, one of our broadcasters over here, did a very long investigation, a journalist by the name of Charlie Peters. They reckon they found at least 50 towns and cities across the UK in which these grooming gangs have operated. We've had one report after another in, whether you want to talk about the Telford grooming gangs, whether you want to talk about places in Oxfordshire, one thing after another. And the response is always this kind of sort of 24-hour news cycle of old lessons must be learned. A tendency, as you suggest, to kind of generalise the problem, to say the issue is attitudes to women in general. We must believe victims in general, which is all fine potentially in terms of how to go about tackling the broad issue. But there's clearly something specific here, which is that these crimes were turned a blind eye to. That essentially the calculus was, it is more important to protect the PR image of multicultural Britain than it is to protect some of the most vulnerable people in society from rape and torture and murder. That was essentially the calculation, whether they realised it or not, that police and various local councils made. And so the one thing it brought definitely was a bit of a sustained attention to it. Again, it would be better if that's something that we could generate internally, but up until this point, that's something that, despite some very commendable individuals who brought this to attention, there's never been that kind of more sustained political response to this unfolding horror that we're talking about.
Speaking about, like, it would be great if you could, you or we, I mean, there's a lot of issues in Sweden that are basically the same. It takes somebody from the outside, and then first reaction is the phony patriotism, like, oh no, don't come here when you have too many guns, and you have Native Americans, and that's not that, and you treated them bad, and also racism, George Floyd and stuff, so you shouldn't, but then you can sort of, it becomes a thing, and then we discuss it, but this was also a part of the J.D. Vance speech. And we have had a lot of phony patriotism react to this. But he said basically that the biggest threat isn't external. I wouldn't really put it like that. And he said, like, basically, like, the elites and institutions increasingly view democracy as legitimate only when it produces the right results. And he talked about the firewall in Germany, like the way they try to keep the Alternative for Deutschland, AfD, away from political power, even though it's the biggest party in all of the former eastern part, the DDR, and they do everything to sort of keep them away. And we had that same phenomenon in Sweden for a long time, up until the last election. And you've also, like, if you look at what you've written, you've also criticized the liberal establishment for dismissing those voters who support populist politicians. So, what is your view on that criticism, that democracy is sort of being becoming something else than it used to mean?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting. I mean, particularly in, say, the US, you see this most explicitly, but the elite seem to have redefined democracy as themselves. So any affront to them, any rejection of them at the ballot box or whatever, is a threat to democracy. So that makes it, having this debate, with them at least, slightly difficult. I think one thing that's become really clear, and it's a bit of a through line of a lot of the issues that we're talking about, is that there is a fundamental kind of fear and loathing of ordinary people amongst the established kind of technocratic class. That's a big driver of the kind of new censorship that we've been talking about. They don't trust people to be able to air their views without being whipped up into kind of some kind of frenzy, or whipping their fellow citizens up in some kind of frenzy. They certainly don't trust them to have a meaningful say, a meaningful vote on which way their society goes, because they're convinced that if they allow them to do that, the worst days of the 1930s are going to return. A lot of these scandals that we're talking about, grooming gangs, Islamism, there is been this tendency to suggest that it doesn't really do to talk about that, because some people will take it to an extreme, or it will prick the prejudices of certain people in society, or it will be hopped on by far rightists or whatever to try and push some kind of advantage. That betrays a fundamental contempt of the electorate. Like, we can't talk about these issues which are confronting some of our poorest, most troubled communities because of the threat of people talking about it in the wrong way. And also, I think on the flip side of that is there's a kind of implicit contempt of the minority communities they claim to be standing up for as well. The idea that if you confront the issue of, say, grooming gangs or Islamism too forcefully, or somehow going to alienate, say, the law-abiding British Muslim majority, is to lump them in with the groomers and the Islamists, which is a formulation I've never understood, and yet they continue to do it. So I think the through line of so much of that's going on and going wrong at the moment is contempt for the public. You see that in the backlash to populism, you see that in the censorship, and you see that in the refusal to deal with these issues, even when they're staring politicians in the face time and time.
I studied political science at the university, and I mean, reading about British politics, basically it's two parties for the longest time.
Mm-hmm.
And I usually bring up the Liberal Party in British politics, because they were one of the few parties in the whole of Europe who didn't understand that if you need to switch from a majoritarian electoral system to a proportional if you give workers voting rights. Everybody else understood that, but the liberals in Britain, they thought that, but they will still vote for us, like,
Mm-hmm.
we will be the party because we are the nice ones. So everybody everywhere else like switched to a proportional, but the politics in Britain has been dominated basically by Labour and Tories, and now if you look at the opinion polls, the biggest party is a third party. Reform, and that's sort of I mean, it's not been an election yet, but it's sort of a revolution if it stays this way. And what explains? We've touched on it, or it's basically been the only thing we've talked about. But what explains that, and what are we to make of it?
No, as you say, potentially it could be really hugely transformative. I mean, because of the first past the post election system that we have, it's very difficult for new entrants to break through. There's been a few periods in history where you've had parties who have started to kind of challenge the established parties on the question of polls and sort of vote share, but it comes to an election and doesn't always materialise because of the way in which the system is structured. But the thing is, first past the post is very unfair until it isn't. And when you've got a situation where a party like Reform was, until a few weeks ago, kind of nudging up towards 30%, there could be a point in which they really do start to break through and gain quite a significant foothold in Parliament. Why we've been brought to that particular position, I think it's very much sort of decades in the making. I mean, we had these two established parties which used to have very clear social bases. So you had the Labour Party and the working class rooted in the labour movement and the trade union movement and what have you. And you had the Conservative Party in terms of the party of the sort of middle class and the establishment, broadly speaking. what's happened over the course of the past 30, 40 years, effectively, is that those connections have started to break down. It certainly happened with the Labour Party. We increasingly saw working class voters moving away from it, sometimes just into not voting, but nevertheless becoming increasingly kind of disaffected with the kind of middle class metropolitan drift of the Labour Party. You had a Conservative Party which seems to be, for many years, kind of going out of its way to distance itself from more kind of traditional conservative values as well. You had the Conservative Party used to kind of be talked about as the kind of the Church of England at prayer. It had kind of certain roots in society as well. And yet it became, particularly in the 2000s, kind of preoccupied with the idea that it was the nasty party, that it wanted to kind of purge itself of these kind of unfashionable, provincial, middle class people who it comes to see as more of a problem as much as anything else. And then you had the moment of Brexit, which I think was something which really, in particular, pried working class voters away from the Labour Party, but also made the Tory Party, which ended up kind of hitching its wagon to Brexit for various reasons, less palatable for many middle class people. So the nutshell version, I suppose, of the fact that we now live in much more volatile political times. The days in which either of those two parties could always count on roughly a third of the electorate rooted in class interests has sort of completely broken down. And so things are a lot more up for grabs now. And you've had reform come in, and whether people want to like it or dislike it, agree with it or disagree with it, it is speaking to certain issues which both parties are seen to be weak on, are seen to have failed on, whether that's the issue of migration, whether that's the issue of net zero and the sort of environmentalist consensus amongst our established parties, all sorts of issues, and they're cleaning up off the back of it. How long can it last, I suppose, is the question. Can it actually materialise? Does Reform and Farage have a kind of ceiling because of past baggage that he in particular has built up from being in British politics for so long? All that remains to be seen, but it's clear that we're not going back to the old ways of doing things. We are in a new era where people are interested in alternatives in the way that they weren't previously. And at the moment, Farage and Reform are the ones who are benefiting from that, but it's kind of up for discussion as to who will turn that into a longer term, kind of more established party of this new era that we find ourselves in.
I mean, when we talk about populism, I mean, it's been a sort of it's a nasty word. That's populist. You can use it as a condemnation, and but I mean, it's sort of been sort of the queer where we reclaimed the word. I mean, I see more and more use it as something positive. I'm here, I'm queer, I'm populist. No, but because sort of it goes back basically as so much does to the Roman Empire, but the Roman Republic. Like you want to talk to the populace, and the populace talks through you, and you want to represent them. And like, okay, but that sounds an awful lot like democracy to me.
Yeah.
And so what you've talked about is like, and you've written a lot about, is like the space of democracy is like sort of shrunken, and you sort of condemn these populist movements, and they're dangerous. And I don't deny they can be dangerous, but sometimes you need people to say the truth, even if it can be dangerous, and you have, and the alternative might be worse than doing that. And you actually had an interesting piece. I say that because I've said it myself, that we actually, polarization isn't in itself wrong. We shouldn't fear it. We should welcome it. It's how we get to the truth. And I think this ties into the populism sort of moment as well. Like, so could you just explain what you mean by that, and if you see any dangers at all with polarization?
No, I think it's an important point, because polarization is often presented as in and of itself a bad thing. It's kind of equated, I suppose, with being either you're kind of whipped up over issues that don't really matter. You know, we're really polarized around all these culture wars that are of no consequence. It's kind of one way that it's talked about. It's also, I think, a bit of a confusing word, because it's often used in a very kind of one-sided fashion. I mean, polarization implies that there are two poles, perhaps potentially as extreme as each other. and yet it's only ever really thrown at, say, the populists rather than the increasingly quite extreme elites that the populists are responding to. So there's a lot of sort of rubbish you've got to clear away before you can start talking about these things in a kind of clear-eyed fashion. But polarization is not necessarily a bad thing, depending on what the issues you're polarizing around.
Did you say clear-eyed fascism?
Fashion was, if I did say fascism,
just
I didn't.
kidding. Yeah.
Just to be
clear-eyed. We need to talk about this with a clear-eyed fascism. Yes. Yeah.
One has to be careful these days.
Yeah.
You know, it's one of those things where it's about the issue that you're polarizing around. America's a really good example. America was not a particularly polarized society, politically speaking, until the civil rights movement. The point at which you really start to see political polarization in America is when the questions of civil rights, of are black American citizens or are they not, begin to kind of creep into politics in a much more important fashion. I think that's a debate that should be had, and obviously I'd be on the side of civil rights in that instance. It's something where sometimes there are issues which the reason there is no polarization around them is because they're not being dealt with, because they're not being discussed, because we're not dealing with them. And I think the same could easily be said about a lot of the issues that confront European societies today. A lack of democracy, the extent to which people aren't being given a genuine choice. If the opposite of polarization is there being no meaningful democratic choice whatsoever, I know which one I'd pick. And I think it's just one of those words which is thrown up often quite misleadingly as a way to just try and tamp down on any kind of dissent from a sort of elite consensus. I think that is increasingly untenable, particularly because people have realised that the elite consensus on all of these issues could be migration, integration, multiculturalism, the questions of environmentalism and net zero, free speech, democracy, what have you. People have come to realise that the elite consensus is not just like wrong, it's obviously destructive as well. So if we're told that we can't challenge it because otherwise we're being too polarising, that's clearly not about anything other than just trying to limit democracy rather than limit the extremes, which I suppose is the way that it's often presented.
Yeah, and there's a supposition underlying, I think, also philosophically, that I think we have in our culture, and it's like the truth is somewhere in between.
Mm-hmm.
And many issues, that's not the case. There's an issue here in Sweden that it's probably, I haven't seen it in other countries, but it's probably there as well, of international adoption. And you had this one guy, basically, who's adopted from Korea, Tobias Hübinette.
Mm-hmm.
And he's been a left-wing extremist, and he's been like convicted of stuff, and he's said extreme stuff. But this was an issue that he was really investigating. And he was saying like, there's a lot of bad stuff here going on here, and it's been going on for quite some time. And he was like the extreme position. And then it turns out, so basically you could say like, oh, he's a nutcase.
Mm-hmm.
But just a few years ago, more people started looking into it and like using his data, because he had compiled so much data, and I mean he's a scientist, and basically it turns out that he was right all along, and all the sensible, like middle of the road people were actually wrong, and it's sort of like the minority extreme position of this then political extremist. Actually, it turns out he was right, and 95% of us, the rest of us, were wrong. And so now the consensus shifted, and now so that position that he held, which was the extreme position 10 years ago, is now the mainstream position, and to hold what was the mainstream position is the extreme position. And so the truth was not in between; it was actually the extreme position had the truth of the matter.
And you think about how many positions which were previously seen to be extreme, which are now seen as commonsensical, positive. I mean, even if we're talking about, this is such a well-worn and trite point, but it is true. Like things that we genuinely cherish now, democratic rights, free speech, women's rights, minority rights, what have you, were seen as insane not that long ago. We're seen as the road to ruin. We're seen as dangerous, extremist, and so on. So if you create an environment in which the ability to voice or express, or whether that's at the ballot box or just in the world of debate and discussion, supposedly extreme positions, then you're going to close yourself off to things that might well be true, that might well be important, that might well be positive. And that's something that I thought was obvious to people who were living in these things that we call liberal democracies. And yet the fact that it has to be kind of remade all the time and seems like a kind of very strange, or some people would paint it kind of abstract idea, is worrying given the fact that there's so much that we genuinely cherish today that was once seen as crazy and out of hand and all the rest of it.
Thank you so much, Tom Slater, for being part of Rak Höger.
Thank you.
Och stort tack till er som lyssnar. Och detta är alltså en del av en större publikation på Substack med samma namn som podden, och du hittar alltihop på www.enrakhöger.se. Och har ni några frågor eller synpunkter så tveka inte att höra av er på ivararpi@substack.com. Vi hörs om en vecka igen.